All right, thanks everyone for joining us for this breakout session on the history of our African art collection here at MSSU. We are really excited that Dr. Christine Bentley could go through this with us. She's an associate professor of art history and teaches art history, gallery studies, and art appreciation. She's also led several international art experiences abroad and is the director of our Spiva Gallery on campus. And today she's going to be providing us with an overview and background of our African art collection. So thank you so much, Christine.
Yes,
I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us for this session. I'm excited to share a bit more about our African art collection here on campus. I'm going to expand my screen a bit. So I'm not sure how many of you are aware that we have a fairly extensive African art collection on campus. And as you can see here, we kind of call it the vault from which it has emerged. It's still kind of in a vault because we don't have a lot of exposure with it, but we are trying to kind of do a little bit more outreach through some grants that we've applied to and received, some programs that we're participating in that I'm going to let you know a bit more about. We have approximately 500 objects or so in the collection, and these come from donations from approximately 5 different families that were local families in Joplin. The university received this donation at the end of, I'm trying to think which year it was, probably, well, the end of the 1990s is when the majority of the donations came to campus. The largest donation coming in 1997 by the Finley family. And so we currently have the collection housed in the basement of the library, and the Finley collection probably takes up about 3/4 of the space within what we call our storage area for the collection. And the collection has been assessed by a number of museums and African art specialists. When I first came to the university, I kept hearing about this collection that we had. And I would ask people, well, where is it at? Because I hadn't really had time at that point to kind of go into the storage area of which the collection was being housed at the time. And there was just this reference of, you have to see this African art collection because, you know, it's valued quite high, and it had been appraised, and that there was this wide variety of objects. And I did have a bit of a background in African art prior to coming to MSSU, because I had taught at the University of Indianapolis for 10 years prior to coming here. And at the same time, I was finishing my graduate work at Indiana University in Bloomington, and had taken classes primarily in Islamic art, because I have a major area of specialization in research and modern art, but I have 2 minor areas of specialization in the Renaissance and then Islamic art. So I had taken some classes that covered Northern Africa, some of my Islamic art classes. So I had a little bit of background, but I wasn't really sure what to do with the information I was receiving, because I would ask everyone, well, where is the collection? and it was probably about 6 months where finally I was taken to the collection, and I went down into the basement of the art building, and there is this really small room. It's kind of unreal actually when I go down there now, but it's about 12 foot by 12 foot. And it was boxes. There were boxes from floor to ceiling, and kind of peeked in a few. And I was really amazed at the objects that I was finding as I was opening up some of these boxes. And I didn't have enough time at the moment to completely, unveil the collection at that time. But I was amazed, because there's everything from statues to masks to kind of, everyday common objects that you might, use on a daily basis. And so at that point, I had made a goal to the coming summer, the summer of at the end of my first year here, that I would reserve some space at some time in the gallery, and we would then bring these boxes up into the gallery and start to just unpack these boxes so I could see what was going on. And I just, wanted to get a better feeling for what it was that I was seeing and hearing about this collection. So I can't remember exactly what the order was, but I had some student assistants and some faculty who volunteered, and we started to take the boxes out that summer. And it was almost as if we were, this sort of slow unveiling of almost as if it was a clown car. I'll tell people sometimes it's sort of a joke because there was more and more and more objects, and they just kept coming. And I was really shocked that we had so many objects, and we laid them out on the gallery floor. And thankfully, the majority of the collection was very well preserved. There had been some objects that had been stored on the top of lockers in the basement that had mold. And so we had to do some very basic conservation type work by removing the mold, and we did so properly. But once I had everything laid out on the floor, I was a little bit not only like impressed once again by what it was that I was seeing, but I was overwhelmed. So I had to go to administration to get approvals to find a space for this collection, because I made the argument with I have a museum studies certificate and background, and I just said we cannot just leave these objects in cardboard boxes in the basement of the art building. Thankfully, though, this room being in the basement really was kind of an ideal situation in terms of what was available, because the humidity was low. There was no light. And so I think that was great for the collection in terms of preservation. But thankfully, the administration was supportive, and we did find space in plaster. We found 2 classrooms, which we converted into archival spaces. And we did get some funding to purchase humidity regulators and archival lining for shelves. And we covered the windows, and we got dehumidifiers, and we did our best to create a safe space in terms of just continuing to attempt to preserve these objects. So that's where these assessments came into play, because in order to get more funding, and I'm still in the process of searching for funding, I had to get opinions of experts in the field of African art and African cultural studies and museum studies, essentially, or just museum professionals in general. So we did invite staff from the Spencer Museum of Art in 2014 to come out and assess the collection. So Cassandra Messick, who is the curator of global and indigenous art, and Angela Watts, who was the associate collection manager at the Spencer Museum of Art, they came out and they surveyed the collection, and they wrote up a report. And they said that we have such a unique gem of a collection of objects that they were also surprised that more hadn't been done with it, because these objects are, certainly, as we know with any artifact or art object, monetary value is, really not what truly measures the value of the object. It's just the educational opportunities behind speaking about these objects and teaching about the cultures from which they come or they originate. It has so much value, and they were impressed, to say the least, in terms of the breadth of the collection. We then had a specialist actually come out a couple of years ago, Dr. Elizabeth Morton, who's an African art specialist at Wabash College, and she is the recent curator of a reinstall of the African art collection at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. She said the same thing. So we were just continuing to get these sort of these moments from professionals and specialists in the field that were saying, you really need to do more with this. And so I applied for a conservation assessment program grant through the can't even remember the name of now, through the Heritage, the Cultural Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. And we received the grant, and we participated in the program in 2020. As you can see, I first looked at the collection and unveiled the collection in 2014. And so really from 2014 until 2020, we spent time finding a space for the collection. We spent time cataloging the collection, doing some provenance on the objects, really creating a foundation for which we could apply for some of these programs to prove that we're paying attention to the needs of the collection in terms of preservation and some minor, conservation that was needed for the objects. So once we stabilized the collection and we created this storage space for it and an archival storage space at that, we then were able to apply for some of these programs. And the CAP program, which we participated in 2020 and completed in 2021, then referred us on to what's called the Museum Preservation Program grant, which we're currently completing. And in the meantime, I created an African art committee, and through the council of the committee, it's faculty from throughout the campus and staff at the library who are either familiar with the historical background of the objects or archives, or have an educational background. So they have been great in terms of just keeping things going and motivated and completing those checklists in terms of what the CAP program recommended. The museum assessment program we received in 2021, and we received the final report last month. And so we're in the process of completing the final report, and now we'll be moving forward with recommendations. But again, all of these program grant assessors and professionals that we've worked with just continue to affirm, that we need to make sure that we are preserving this collection. So in 1997, the collection was appraised, and it was through that appraisal that the Finley collection was valued quite high. And we moved the collection from the basement of the library to plaster. It is now housed, at the basement of the art building to plaster, is now housed in the library in a rather large room. And we have both a storage area for the collection, and then we have an educational space where faculty on campus can bring their students to teach courses, whether it's history or anthropology or certainly those courses that I teach in art history. So we're also aiming to have these kind of interdisciplinary teaching moments. So the collection is culturally and geographically diverse. It comprises both ritual and everyday items and a variety of media. And again, from these initial surveys of the collection, and the information that we're gathering from African art specialists, they can identify approximately 40 distinct ethnic groups and communities that are represented through the art and material culture in this collection. Most of the objects originate from sub-Saharan areas of Africa, with particularly strong representation from West and Central Africa. And you can see some of those objects here. So as I mentioned, the breadth of the collection is really it's quite diverse, and there are so many different types of objects. So we have masks, we have headrests, funerary headrests, we have objects that are both ceremonial and objects of everyday life and use. The oath taker figures are probably the stars of the collection. I say that with some hesitation, because I think that that's how they've been identified by some of these professionals, because it's rare to see some of these objects that are not in major museum collections so well preserved and intact. Now, the small one that's being held by staff here is the oath taker. So we have t-shirts and magnets with this figure, because it is the most valuable at this point object in terms of the monetary value of the object, but I would also say in terms of just the object itself. The oath takers tend to be about that size. The ones on the right, or the figure on the right, is debated as to whether or not this was actually used as an oath taker. It's thought to potentially be like a touristy kind of object that would be used to attract tourists. Now, I have had Elizabeth Morton said, no, this was probably not an object that was used in tourist type situations. This was probably an object that was used as a sort of a guardian figure outside of some type of sacred space. but we don't know for sure because we haven't had an opportunity to do a ton of research on these particular objects. But you can see here with the oath taker figures, what we have here, you have these nails that have been hammered in and through those, you can see, little satchels, and inside of these sometimes you might have fragments of some type of offering, and an agreement or an argument has been sort of bound to the figure, and that's why it's called the oath taker. This idea that this agreement, this argument, this contract has been bound to this figure, and so therefore it's it's a done deal kind of thing. So I have not had an opportunity yet, but I've been told that I should take some of these figures to a dentist who can do x-rays on the figures so that we can see what might be inside of these tiny packets. We also have other oath taker type figures that are similar to the other one that are rather large. And again, we don't know the true function of these figures, but Dr. Morton is fairly convinced that they were probably used as guardian figures. The other strengths of the collection include the Kuba cloth. We have Central African dance masks, metal weaponry, headrests, funerary headrests, combs, stone figures. And although not all of the works are ritual or ceremonial, even the objects of everyday life, such as the heddle pulleys and the gold weights, are considered to be of significant value. So we have here a circumcision cloth, which Dr. Morton said is incredibly rare. And we have this ceremonial kind of head covering that, again, it's difficult to find some of the objects. She feels that really the strength of our collection is in some of these objects that are used for everyday purposes. So ceremonial circumcision cloth might not be every day, but or some of the combs that we have, or some of the game boards that we have, because they're very difficult to find, because typically these are not objects that would be freely given. And since we had one of our donors was a missionary, she was part of she was in a situation where she had developed significant trust with the individuals that she was working with, and they were giving her these objects, and these are the objects that were donated to us. Excuse me. And so here we have the kente cloth, and then we have this is a part of it's not a shirt, but it is a sort of a covering of other costumes that you might wear. Here are an example of other textiles. We do have a significant amount of textiles, and I have recently, only 2 weeks ago, applied for an NEH, a grant through the National Endowment for Humanities grant for small museums. It's a preservation grant for small museums, and part of that grant I have proposed some textile rolls, because the way that we are currently storing them is not the best way, but so we are aware of that. But we have textiles here that are both the primary purpose is aesthetic, or you have some that are more ceremonial, as you can see here. Weaponry is another strength of the collection. We have a lot of weapons. We have knives, we have axes. Here you have, this is actually a paddle. My students who work with the collection get a kick out of this object, because you would place the sword, if we want to call it a sword, into the paddle, and you would use that. So it has a sort of dual function. And most of the weapons that we have are more than likely ceremonial. Now, some of the axes, of course, certainly seem to have been functional, and they are not quite as decorative as you see here. But we do believe that most of them are ceremonial. And this is an example of one of the axes that we think probably was functional. as is this knife. We have had all of the, well, not all of the objects, but the majority of the collection has been on display at some point. We have a biannual exhibition of the African art collection. I teach a class called African Art every other summer, and it is a 4-week class, and the goal of the class is for the class to end with an exhibition of the objects from the collection that the students want to put on display. So, and certainly it's guided by me because I want typically to display objects that haven't been on display or are stable enough to be displayed within the exhibition. But what they do in the class is they select their objects. They then have to write text panels on the objects. They have to present on the country that their objects are, that their objects were, located within. So there's an entire process, but the class ends with a full-fledged exhibition of the objects. The headrests are also another part of the collection that is impressive. And it's because of the type of funerary headrests that we have. And so essentially what you're seeing here are headrests where the body of the deceased, the head of the deceased would be propped up with this headrest underneath the head of the deceased. And so we have some that are quite simple, as the one in the top left, whereas others are a little bit more elaborate, as those on the bottom of the screen here. We have combs. We have a variety of combs, and again, they range from those they're very plain, whereas the ones on the right, as you can see, are a little bit more decorative. And I think we have probably a total of 10 combs. So this is just an example of a few. We have a couple of stone figures that are believed to be dated back to the end of the 16th century, which would be the oldest items in the collection. We do not know the dates of, I would say, a good fourth of the collection, because again, 3/4 of the collection is from the Finley collection, and they were professionally appraised. But we have this other fourth of the collection, if not more, that have never been appraised. And I don't even think the majority of the objects from the Finley collection have not been dated. So we do think, though, that these objects are from the 16th century based on one of those appraisals. And this is a stone figure, as you can see here. It's quite abstract, which is typical of African art. You do have some indication that it's a human, or a seemingly, at least, reflection of a human figure. And that's seen through the shells for the eyes and the mouth, right? And then this is the overall shape of the object. Don't know the exact function, but more than likely it was ceremonial to represent some type of spirit. We have metal figures that are thought to be weights. And these are also dated quite early. I don't think that they're actually dated towards the end of the 17th century. The hunter's vest is another one of those objects that typically, when I have visitors come into the collection that are scholars within the field, certainly those that came to assess the collection, or whether they were from the Spencer Museum of Art or Wabash, or those that came from the Cultural Heritage Foundation, they're always sort of pooled to this vest. It is, and I have asked each of them, well, why are you so drawn to this? Because there is this visual reaction to the vest in almost everyone who sees it. And they've said that they're drawn to it because it has so many of these plaques that are on display. What you have here are each of those little, as you can see here, these square shaped wood plaques. Some of them are covered, right? When you open them, those that are no longer covered, they reveal fur. There are a few that actually have bones in them, but you also can see here, you've got the head, the skull of bird, the skull of a monkey, and then you have claws from other animals. And then you have hooks where we can imagine other plaques would have been placed. And I've been told that there are very few of these hunters' vests that, again, are so well intact, but have so many of these plaques on display. And essentially what it's showing here, according to these scholars, is the fur of every animal that this particular hunter would have killed. And so it's a way of not only commemorating the spirit of the animal, but also certainly the hunter himself. We have many wood statues and a variety of wood statues, some that are entirely abstract as the one on the left, some that are a little bit more representational as those on the right. Certainly most wood statues, it is incredibly rare, especially if it's ceremony, that you're going to find a statue that is realistic or, you know, something that's portrait-like. And that's one of the things about African art that was so impressive to Western artists towards the end of the 1800s, or the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It said that Picasso, once he saw African art on display in Paris, like it was almost game over for him. He was so heavily influenced by what the African art displays were saying to him in terms of this freedom from truly representational art, and all that had been taught to them for so long, from the quote unquote academies and academic art, art that had to be classical or reference the Renaissance artists. It was really something that freed them and affirmed that, you know, abstraction was okay. And so it's typical to find statues that are similar to this, where, say, the proportions are off, or whether it's the proportions of, you know, the necks of the figures, the arms, the legs, or even the shape of the head, or the eyes might not be symmetrical. So we have many wood statues, and they all, you know, look quite a bit different from one another. We have other figures that are similar to the oath takers, not the one on the left that's considered to be a ceremonial kind of like puppet that's part of a dance, and you would use this as part of that that ritual. But the one at the bottom here, again, you have this sort of rather exaggerated midsection of the figure that we believe there are objects or materials and the interior of this vessel. You have this figure that has beads draped over it, so it's thought to have been some type of personal prayer object. Saying prayer loosely, but you know, an object in which you're participating in it, like a personal ritualistic sacred moment. I was told, I'm always hesitant to bring up, there are stories behind the African art collection on MSSU, on the campus of MSSU, and Amber knows some of these stories. She's on the committee with me. But there are stories of hauntings of the African art collection. I personally have never experienced any of these, but I've had two scholars of African art come to view the collection. Dr. Morton was one, and I unfortunately at the moment cannot remember the other woman who came, who actually delivered a talk. But they both told me that I should be really weary of these two objects. Now I'm a, how would I describe myself? I'm a curious skeptic. I find these stories fascinating, but it won't prevent me from going into the African art cage alone at midnight, right? So we've had a number of things happen as a result of these events, even to the point of where we had a blessing ceremony on campus. of the African art collection where a shaman came to the collection to bless the collection, to, in her words, calm the spirits of the collection, because we have so many um, rival tribes and areas of Africa that are represented within our collection. They felt like maybe this is why these haunting events were taking place. So what are these haunting events? I won't get into it too much because we don't have a ton of time, but for example, I was called in the summer of, I think it was 2019, from a staff member whose office was in the suite with the African art collection in the basement of Plaster. And she said, I think you need to come over here. And I said, why? She said, I'm hearing strange things in the collection room. And I asked her, well, what are these things that you're hearing? And she says, well, I'm hearing shrieking sounds. And so I asked her, well, what do you mean shrieking sound? I'm hearing actual shrieking, like human shrieking sounds, and like things clamoring about in the room. And I couldn't understand what that might be, because we had never at that point had anything. There may have been moments with the students where they'd say an object was moved, but so I went there, and when I came into the room, the room on the south part of the suite was flooded with water, and then the room, sort of what we had identified as the north part of the suite, was dry for the most part, except for one section. And so we knew that we immediately had to move the collection, because I hadn't been there for about 3 weeks, and already, just enough, probably they think that the flood had taken place a few days earlier, but the humidity was so high, there was already evidence of mold. So that was a whole other series of problems. That's how we moved it from that space to the library. And thankfully, administration on campus was supportive of that move. But no one could figure out maintenance. No one could figure out the source of the water, and they couldn't figure out the source of why some of the objects had fallen off the shelves. They couldn't figure out the source of the shrieking sound. So when I told the story to these two women who came at 2 separate times, they both told me that it was because of, they said it half jokingly, right? That it was probably because of these contesting tribes, and that water was needed to bless the tribe. And so that led them to, or the object, so that then led to this performance that we had on campus last fall. So then they told me that I should never touch either of these objects, these 2 objects, with bare hands. So that's just sort of as an aside to the collection. We have masks, and some of the masks are seen as more ceremonial, whereas some of the masks are seen purely as tourist type masks. So the one on the left is seen as a tourist mask, whereas the one on the right is seen as more authentic, and as something that would be used as part of private performances, like ceremonial performances. What does that mean? Well, the one on the left is certainly not garish, but it is, you can see there's more color, it's decorated a bit more, and the one on the right is a bit more plain. So what would happen, and what still happens, is that there are performances for Westerners. And so you can go to different countries in Africa and probably even pay for a performance. But that is not a true, ceremonial moment that you're participating in. That is a performance that is made specifically for you to view as a Westerner. So they have different types of objects that they use for these. And that is something also that we need to keep in mind, is that we are always viewing these objects as works of art, right? This is how we have classified these objects. This is how we see them. We put them on pedestals, we hang them on the wall. And I have the woman who came to speak, who she actually had lived in various parts of Central Africa, had reminded me of that. You have to keep in mind that you're looking at this point now as static object that has no real function or remembrance even of the original object itself, because the object that we're looking at here is part of a larger costume. It's part of there's music, there's sound, human sound that plays along with these objects. There's costume, there's all kinds of things that we have to keep in mind in terms of contextualizing the object. And so we have these masks here, and we do try our best to, when we put these objects on display, we almost always have video where we are showing video of the objects or a similar type of object being used in its original context. So we have, again, a variety of types of masks, and they range from objects, as we see here, that are solid wood, whereas there are some objects that have raffia grass, or we actually have a couple of objects that are not masks, but they're rattles that have real human hair. So I will have people ask me, is that real human hair? No, it's not. It's either some type of fiber or it is raffia grass, actually. We have other objects that are just kind of in their own category. This is an object that the scholars who have asked specifically about it, this is not necessarily a mask. It's actually something that would have been worn on top of the head. So it's not classified as a mask. But it is covered in cow dung. And so we have to be really careful with this object, because when we first brought it up from the basement of the art department, there were mites, there were pests in it. So we had to put it in the freezer and put it in quarantine for a while. So we do have a process now where if an object shows any indication of mold or pests, we immediately have to freeze it. It stays in the freezer for a certain amount of time. Then we will remove any of the, if we can see them, either the pests itself or the carcass of the pest, and then we will place it in an additional amount of time in quarantine. We've got a quarantine room. And then it may or may not be reintroduced into the collection. Most objects that we put into quarantine are eventually reintroduced into the collection, but so it is a rather long process. Then this is actually a game that's similar to Mancala, as you can see. So again, what have we done to in our attempts to preserve the collection? We have relocated the collection twice. Once just because we were wanting to create a space for it, and then the second time because of the flood. We've cleaned objects. We've done our best to preserve the objects with the resources that we have. We've done a number of fundraising events where we actually would have the objects on display, and then we would allow visitors within the art gallery to, quote, adopt a piece. So they could adopt a piece by, doing any sort of a wide range of monetary donations. So starting at, I believe, $50. So you could adopt a piece for 50, or you could go up to, I think we've had individuals adopt a piece for like $500. And then your name is permanently placed within our records as being kind of, having adopted that piece or donated to the collection through the adoption of a piece. Again, we have a biannual exhibition. We purchased Past Perfect, which is an online, well, it's actually a collection database that we have on the computers within the collection room, but you can also access Past Perfect online, and you can see the objects online from anywhere. But if you want to have the full provenance of the objects, you have to be in the collection room. And we're actually, based on recommendations through the museum assessment program, probably going to keep Past Perfect, but we're also going to start cataloging the exhibition into a new type of online cataloging system. And so again, we cataloged all of the objects and did a significant amount of work. It took us quite a bit of time because I'm also full-time faculty. So I'm full-time faculty, but I am also the director of the art gallery and the curator of the African art collection, which I lovingly embraced, because I had as a historian and as a museum studies specialist, I could not put it back in the basement. So, and then we've done some research. I would love it if we had more time to do more research. And then we do general collection care on a regular basis. So I do have 2 student employees who go over there and they check humidity levels every single day. We found out kind of the hard way that we needed to check humidity levels every single day in terms of receiving grant money and being successful in grant applications, because they always ask us, what are the humidity levels? So they check the humidity levels. They also check the temperature. We're actually, still doing that every day. We keep a log, and we watch for any dramatic changes in the humidity, because that's certainly not creating a stable environment for the collection. We also created this cage that houses the objects. So that's what we've done in terms of securing the collection, because we have this fairly large room for the collection in the basement of the library, which is within the new Global Studies Center, but and next to archives in the library. And the library has been so generous in allowing us to have the space. But we then so we have this rather large space, but then we also have a wood cage that has been created. It's a wood frame with archival plastic covering either side of the frame. And then we have shelves lining the interior of that sort of rather large rectangular shaped cage that was created by the physical plant. And then we organize the interior of the cage according to accession number. So each object, of course, has an accession number. And we labeled the shelves and units for easy access and reference to the accession number. So if you were to come to conduct research on an object and you go to the catalog, you find the object you want, you write down the accession number, and then you can go into the cage and you can easily find the object. And then we do annual inventory checks. So my gallery studies class, which is every spring, and actually I'm currently teaching gallery studies. One of the things that they do within the class, which is incredibly beneficial to them as students, right? Because they are performing and not only inventory checks, but they have collection care sheets. And so they have to select 15 objects from the collection that they then write for every single object. They do a collection care report. And that collection care report lets us, they restate the title, they do the measurements of the objects again, just to make sure that nothing has changed. They do visual checks for pests, for mold, for any damage that potentially could have happened. They then they draw each object just for records. And then they have to, of course, clean the area we vacuum the collection, because of course we don't use any cleaning solutions in the collection room. But so that though is part of our annual inventory check. And so that class is very helpful with that. I already talked quite a bit about the relocation of the collection, but we have the dehumidifiers, the archival liners, the air purifiers. We have humidity and temperature regulators within the collection now, and that this organizational system according to accession number. So we're doing our best to preserve it, again, with the cataloging of the Past Perfect software. As you can see here at the gallery studies course, the students are taught not just to perform these collection care sheets, but they're taught about collection care, collection management. We discuss not only the history of the collection, but we do a little bit of the history of museums and gallery studies, and how is that applicable to our collection in our class in terms of what we're doing in learning about preservation and conservation techniques and handling objects. They also learn a bit about, the exhibition process, even though they don't necessarily, well, the gallery studies they participate in exhibitions, but they're helping install the contemporary art exhibitions that are coming into the art gallery. And then of course we do fundraising. This just shows you some of the fundraising events that we've had in the past. And we have, again, these biannual exhibitions. This just shows you kind of what some of these shows might look like. Now, this particular exhibition was kind of salon style. Most of the exhibitions are not so crowded with objects. We make it look a little bit more, we like fewer objects in there so that the visitor can learn more about any given object with the text panels. I would say similar to what we have here. Here are some more pictures of exhibitions. A few more. So I'm often asked this question in terms of, what are some of the concerns moving forward? And certainly collection care, and that's why I recently applied to this NEH grant, is just having access to funding to properly care for the collection, because certainly we have had support from the administration at different moments, but there are needs that are kind of greater than what we can provide. It's stable. It's very stable, and thankfully that's always been a compliment to these assessors who are coming out from DC to assess what it is that we're doing. And certainly those assessments are going to be used, and they were used for this recent NEH grant application. But there are plans to apply for more grants. There are plans to collaborate on grants with the library and archives. So Amber, Carr, and I, and applying for some that will be, I believe, deadlines this summer or next fall. So collection care is always on our mind, and preservation, doing more fundraising, just the conservation of the collection, and meeting those goals that we've been establishing with these programs that we've been able to participate in, and just having more visibility on campus with the collection, because we have this really great resource and really an amazing collection of objects, and a lot of people on campus don't know anything about it. And certainly I think that there is an interest, once people learn more about this collection, there is an interest, but we would like to have more opportunities to present the collection and have it used in other classes or other events on campus. And so I'm grateful that we're able to talk about it today. And then just storage, because we have utilized every bit of space just about within the cage, as we call it. So being able to have more space for the collection, or if we were to, be presented with opportunities to bring in more objects, we would like to be able to do that, but we don't have that opportunity right now. So that's it in terms of formal presentation. Just wanting to open it up to discussion or questions, or even ideas of moving forward or thoughts.
Yeah, and I want to thank you so much for that presentation. I was really glad you were able to share with us today. We do have just a few minutes, and I'm not sure how Kyle and they will run the breakout rooms, because I know we're almost to time, but Jody, yeah. Do you have a question, Jody?
Unmute myself, sorry. First of all, thank you so much. I'm relatively new to campus, so this was great to hear that this exists, because I didn't know that. A lot of the pieces that you were showing us today seem like they're very historically situated. It's a little bit older. Are there also areas or thoughts to, I don't know, it could exist and maybe wasn't part of our discussion today, for some pieces that are more contemporary or recent?
No, I would say the majority of the objects are coming from throughout the 1800s and into probably the oldest are the mid 20th century. And that some of those are some framed pieces, which are really interesting, but nothing that's contemporary now, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you.
So the framed pieces, though, and some of the textiles are interesting, because if you're talking about contemporary art or referencing contemporary art, some of the pieces look very contemporary, like for example the Kuba cloths and some of the other objects that we have that the individuals would wear. The designs and the patterns on them feel contemporary. So
excellent, thank you.
Thanks.
I think we might have time for one more question if anybody has one. It's always the hard thing on Zoom, right? Like how much
Yeah.
time is enough quiet
I don't
time?
know.
Well, perfect. So then I will say we are at 2:05, and the next sessions are due to start at 2:15.